Welcome, everyone. We're really happy that you've joined us today. Today, we have an opportunity to explore a momentous period in U.S. history, and that is the Great Migration. The term refers to the 20th century flow of Southern African American people to northern industrial cities in the East, in the Midwest, and in the West. Over 6 million African Americans had migrated across the country after the Civil War from 1916 to 1970. And we're still migrating, and we're going back to the South. So a lot has happened over the last 300, 400 years of slavery, enslavement, and then about 6 decades of the mass migration. They went to Chicago, and to Detroit, and Cleveland, and New York, and Baltimore. And that number, 500,000 ended up in Chicago, which is the second Black population after New York City. What were the causes of this mass migration of African descendant people? What were the repercussions? Isabel Wilkerson spent 15 years researching this critical phenomenon and interviewed 1,200 people for her groundbreaking book, The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration. And Isabel, in her book, she follows the story of 3 different families of African descent. One went to the Midwest, Chicago, one was in the Mid-Atlantic, and the other one was on the West Coast. And I would recommend this book highly for you if you haven't read it already. It's an amazing story that a lot of us don't even still have an idea of how we entered into all these cities. During Black History Month, students are taught about enslavement or civil rights with a limited focus on Martin Luther King, his speech, or Harriet Tubman, or Rosa Parks. But with that concentration of only a few people, moments like the Great Migration have been lost or missing from our history books. All racial and ethnic groups need to know about their stories of resistance and survival. We also need to know how each of our stories are interconnected to a broader history in this country. The story of the Great Migration has touched not just African Americans or Africans of the diaspora. It has impacted every person's life who lives here in the United States, one way or the other. So what caused people of African descent to leave their homes, their land, their loved ones, an entire community? The economic push factor was the exploitation of sharecroppers, which many Blacks became after emancipation. Men and women were attracted to northern cities for a better quality of life, better work, better education, better health care. And they were looking for the safety of being intimidated on a daily basis, lynch mobs, violence, segregation policies known as the Jim Crow, constant terror and trauma. Between 1880 and 1950, an African American was lynched more than once a week for some perceived injustice. Trauma made them flee. So people made a way by trains, by buses, by cars. Some people walked for a better quality of life. The mass exodus brought to the North and the West and the East the best of the South, the brightest, the hardworking people, innovators, masters of many trades. It brought people such as Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and Toni Morrison and Miles Davis. Migrated African Americans remade the nation in ways that are still being felt today. Yet, and this is where Trent's going to pick up, the cities were not always prepared for the influx of Black Southerners. So people were crowded into Black segregated areas. The areas were defined by racially restricted covenants. Trent?
Thank you, Denise. And so as we look a little bit deeper into the migration story, we have to understand that it doesn't stop, and it hasn't stopped, much as Denise has talked about. And so what we're looking at right now is a timeline from the Undesigned the Redline exhibit. The top is the timeline in reference to all of the things that the government or systems tried to do to essentially remedy, fix, or figure out how to navigate around Black Americans. The things at the bottom are the grassroots things that people did to combat those injustices, those ways of indignity that were pressed upon Black people. And so when we look further into this, we have to understand that in that first era, the 1800s to 1930s, this is where we're talking about the start of the Great Migration. This is where that trauma comes from that we were talking about, the physical persecution or physical violence, persecution of your identity simply because. Things implied or put on you that are undermining your overall humanity, not just your individual humanity. And so as people experienced this down south, there was a promise of what was bubbling at the surface, the American dream, something that we were creating as a people. And as the Great Migration happened, many people were unfortunately not given what they thought they were going to get. And so as we move into the northern cities, as we migrate to the Midwest, the West, what we have is an influx of people in general, as well as an influx of difference of culture. As we dig further into what happened in those northern cities, we have to really, really look at redlining. Redlining is a fundamental factor that undermined the economic principles and the betterment that would essentially give intergenerational wealth to an entire culture, to an entire people. And we're talking about redlining, this mass exodus, millions of people moving, our biggest, our brightest, for a better life, to flee persecution. They move into cities where things are created to undermine their lived experience, to quantify what they can and can't have, to dictate how human they are allowed to be treated in different spaces. And it was a different flavor than what we might have seen in the South. But it had the same, if not more, negative effects. And so as we look at redlining, some of the things that I'm not going to get a chance to get into because we don't have a lot of time, but things that you really should look into: urban renewal, contract buying, planned shrinkage, block busting, speculative investing, predatory banking, deindustrialization, and mass incarceration. Over that timeline, what we can see is that although there were things created to remedy what was done before, we created Jim Crow as a way to get rid of slavery. Then we had the New Deal. Then we had urban renewal. Then we had planned shrinkage, which eventually led to social and civil unrest. And then you have where we're at now in today's era, where we're still feeling the effects of all of these things that we've never remedied. And so again, when we're looking at these examples of what happened, we have to understand that these were in every major city, 230 cities plus. This was specifically implemented. This should all look familiar to us, especially because of the connection, how far, or rather how close we are to Baltimore. Many of our stories originate from Baltimore in terms of moving into Maryland, migrating to Maryland for a better life, migrating to the north. And so what we're seeing right here is a redlining map. And what was created were redlining maps, these maps that would essentially allocate resources and decide who could live where and what resources were going to be put in those areas. And so when you see red on the map, what that means is that there are at least one Black person that lives in that area, and that is enough for us to defund, take resources away, and create dynamics such as white flight, where we scare away people from actually existing in the same space so that they would understand each other's fundamental humanity. An economic impact, a social impact, and an individual impact. From a map that was meant to allocate resources in one specific direction. And that was tethered to race. And so what we see here, which is very unfortunate, and it starts to make sense when we think about where we are today, is that America decided to tether race and socioeconomic status. To allow the intersectionality to not allow us to really question what's going on. And so an example of this, many of you might be familiar with Baltimore. Many of you have probably had a chance to go to the harbor, do some amazing things with family, go to a nice restaurant. And if you're super observant or you've lived in Baltimore, you understand that the harbor area, or the 2 or so streets over, are not like many parts of Baltimore. The roads, the infrastructure, the type of businesses, that's intentionally done. And so that area is referred to actually as the Black Butterfly, where you go outside of that area, outside that harbor area, which what we're looking at right now, if you see that shaded white area, that would be the harbor area. The 2 red squares on each side, those are redlined areas. We're going to take away resources simply because Black people live in those areas. We're not going to put money into the infrastructure, into the schools, simply because Black people live in those areas. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that people move out, primarily white people move out to the outskirts, where we're going to create the suburbs. We're going to subsidize that. And so this is where the American dream is created. Property value is essentially how you pass on intergenerational wealth. How you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, if you will. But when that is fundamentally kept from you, or the spaces that you live in are intentionally defunded so that your property value, even when you own a home, doesn't increase, or that it devalues, or that you're never allowed to actually own the property that your home is on, which is ground rents, which happens a lot in Baltimore, how are you supposed to shift? What ends up happening, unfortunately, is that you get blamed, and your peoples get blamed for the dynamic that is being placed upon you. And to further detail this, when we're talking about housing, which is very important, and we're also talking about this migration story, because there is a migration, again, that we're going to touch upon of peoples from the inner cities, these spaces that we're talking about that are desolate, that are food deserts, that have resources intentionally taken away from them, to the outskirts. What we're looking at right now is the federal underwritten manual. And so although in 1968, the Federal Fair Housing Act came through, what we have to understand is that many people used this as a guideline, and we're still using this as a guideline for how they were interacting with property, how people wanted to live, and where people should live. And as we're looking at this, essentially what it's saying is that it's not that we don't want to live around Black people, but what Black people need to understand is that when they live around us, inherently our property value will go down. So they should just live by themselves. not understanding the mechanics of how resources are being taken away from these places, not understanding the dynamic of people wanting to simply move into a space where they can live their best life, where they can have their dignity affirmed, where they can provide for their family. And so unfortunately, when you have something like this coming from the federal government, you have lenders understanding this language, you have property owners understanding this language, it creates a dynamic where it's very hard from a social space, as well as a cultural space, as well as an institutional and structural space, for people to actually be allowed to participate in the American dream if they are Black or of African American descent. Now, as we shift, again, as I referred to this shift again away from those experiences, the people that had the means, the people that unfortunately didn't get swallowed by the trauma, which unfortunately happens to people. And again, we have to understand that we're talking about trauma. In a lot of these spaces, people get blamed for the spaces that were created for them to live in, the dynamics that they have to live in that create and exacerbate more issues. And so many people tried to leave these spaces. In Maryland, one of the spaces that many people tried to leave and live in was Howard County. And in particular, the Columbia area, because it was created to be the antithesis of what we're talking about right now. Denise is going to dig into a little bit of that a little bit later. But as we're looking at these data points, I also want to point out a dynamic of how we might culturally understand this information that I'm putting forth. Because this is not only Black history or American history, this is the present. This is where we are right now. It's just a different flavor. And so what we're looking at right now is simply the population breakdown by race and ethnicity. I really want us to focus for this presentation at those first 2 or 3 bars. And so when we look at this population size, it's obvious to see that there's a higher population now of white people over every other race. However, something that we need to understand is that when we're trying to disaggregate data, when we're trying to see if there are disparities, which essentially means that there are dynamics or hiccups in our system that are creating unfair situations for people, we need to be able to disaggregate or interpret the data. And so a really quick thing that I would like to do is disaggregate the population size based off of the rate of poverty in the county to illustrate something. And so when we look at this diagram of Howard County, which is essentially showing us who is living below the poverty line by race and ethnicity, what we see is that white and Black are very comparable, about 34 and 33%. However, again, it's easy to look at this and see that, oh, okay, white people, when we're talking about at least money, when we're talking about at least wealth, when we're talking about the definition of the poverty line, seem to be experiencing at the same rate. However, this isn't true. What we need to understand is that when we look at the population, the overall population, 50% of the population is white. And so if we weren't seeing any disparities, any underrepresentation or overrepresentation, what we should see is that the population size and the poverty rate should equal each other, or be around the same space. And so what we actually see is that there's an underrepresentation of white, where we have about 51% of the total population, but as opposed to the poverty rate, we have about 34%. And we have an overrepresentation of Black and African American individuals, where they make up about 19% of the population in Howard County, but about 33% of the poverty rate. And so taking that information in, I want you to pause. As we've talked about the Great Migration, as we've kind of glanced over these different dynamics that have affected from a traumatic standpoint, whether it be psychologically, physically, or monetarily, that things have been intentionally done throughout history to perpetuate these stats. even though we live in a county where there is a space intentionally created to be the antithesis of what we saw. To break things down a little bit further, when we look at the migration story, the immigrant story, because we're all immigrants, we also need to understand the disparities of how immigrant populations might experience Howard County, how they've come to be, how they've established themselves. And so when we look at the poverty rate again, in comparison to Asian individuals, we have about, say about 16%, 17%. And here it's about comparable in terms of the rate of poverty. It's about the same. Doesn't seem like there's any disparities or underrepresentation. And now when we think about that, migration, where people live at, the access to resources, within Howard County, we have to understand where people are allowed to live, where they can live, where they can afford to live, the affordable housing, the things that take into account that history that we just talked about, how welcoming we are as a county. And so when we look at this dynamic, it seems like there is a dense population of Black individuals in a specific part of the county. Not necessarily odd to see in terms of how America was set up, but I want us to think about, when you think about your Harper's Choice, when you think about your Longreach, when you think about your Savage, when you think about those areas, your Oakland Mills, what do you think of in terms of infrastructure in comparison to the rest of Howard County that doesn't have as densely of a Black population? And again, you're made to ask one of two questions. Is there something inherently going on with the system and the way that we're interacting with the system? Or are we saying that people are inherently inferior? When we overlay this with some of the more recent immigrant populations that have migrated, for many reasons that are very similar to the Black experience within their own home origins, home countries, we see the concentrations are very different. And again, I ask ourselves to think about the areas within Howard County, the access to resources, and what does this communicate? What I'm hoping it does is it allows us to open our mind to a larger question that we need to have, or a larger dialogue rather, that we need to have. Uncovering the history, uncovering the things that we don't know that are affecting the ways in which people experience life. And so when we're breaking down these things, when we're looking at our history, it gives us a window into not recreating some of these dynamics and also understanding how we've gotten to where we're at. This is all of our story. It's just an unfortunate reality that there has been an undermining of the Black experience. So now I want to shift gears for us to take things from a more personal standpoint. And so when we're talking about the migration story, we're talking about it from three different spaces. We're talking about it from the collective, that 1916 to 1970, and still going on now. We looked in at how Baltimore is one of those origin cities for redlining and how people shifted and moved. And that Howard County was one of those spaces that they moved in, migrating again. And now what we're going to talk about is our immigration and migration stories, actually, from a personal standpoint.
Thank you, Trent. I think it's very important that we look at the macro level of the mass migration and bring it to the personal level, because a lot of times the macro stories get lost. The personal stories get lost in the macro stories. Real people were impacted by migration. This is a collage of my patriarchal side of my family. In the top left corner is my grandfather, James E. Smith, and that's my dad kneeling next to him. They migrated, my grandfather migrated from the rural areas of Maryland. And he wanted to come to Baltimore for a better quality of life. Next to that picture is my great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother. And everybody in the family was looking for a way of life that was dignified. My grandfather wore bow ties. He had a sense of self-worth. And he wanted the best for his children. And below that is my grandmother, his mom. My father, when he was probably 17, 18 years of age, I think he told me he lied to go into the Navy because he knew that education may not have been the route for him, so he went into the service. And that's my grandmother standing next to him. They grew up in East Baltimore, my father and his sisters and his brother. And then my grandparents in the 60s moved out to Catonsville. They migrated to Catonsville because they wanted to have a better life, and the redlining that was going on in Baltimore and the accessibility to housing was a challenge. And so my grandparents moved out to Catonsville, Maryland. They migrated out there. And there's a Black community in Catonsville that I'm very familiar with. And then that's my mother and father, Letha and James Smith, who were Baltimoreans to their hearts. And my father moved out and migrated from Baltimore for a better way of life for his children, my sister and my brother. And my aunts followed my father to Columbia, Maryland. In 1970, we moved in Columbia. So migration is constant. It's constant. It doesn't stop. Because when you're not treated fairly, when you feel like you can't buy a home in a neighborhood that's going to be safe when there's white flight. We moved into a neighborhood in Northwest Baltimore. By the time I was in the 8th grade, it was an integrated neighborhood. It was all Black by the time I was in the 8th grade. And so moving to Columbia for my parents was a dream that they didn't want deferred. They wanted better education for us. They wanted to have a home where they wouldn't be robbed, or they had a home in a cul-de-sac. There was one way in and one way out. And so I'm going to turn it over to Trent to tell his family story of migration. And Trent, tell us your story.
Thanks, Denise. So it's actually interesting because one of the realities of our migration stories is that things get lost. Family history is very hard to find, especially when we go back and we recognize that many peoples were enslaved and records were just not kept. And so a large portion of my family history on certain parts is like really hard to just find, to understand what happened. What we're looking at right now is my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather on my mom's side, Mary Scott and Herman White. And so on that side of the family, I'm sure you can tell my grandmother, Mary Scott, was very light. And so on that side of the family, we essentially had access to some land because someone who owned an enslaved person ended up having a child with them. And then when they passed, they gave some land to them. Now that land, they cultivated it, made peanuts, tobacco, cotton. At that time, service industry jobs is essentially like all you could really do. And so it was a living. Unfortunately, at this time, this was in North Carolina and South Carolina, weevil infestation happened. Destroyed all of the crops. As a result, family had no way of living, couldn't pay for the home, and had to leave. And so they ended up moving and basing in Virginia, in the Tidewater region. So Chesapeake, Norfolk, Newport News, Chuckatuck, all of that area, Suffolk, which was actually a larger Black community. Many people moved into that area. But also something I was just thinking about, and this actually just came to me as I was listening to Denise's story, is that we're talking about these stories of migration, of trying to move and flee the persecution of things that were happening in the South. And in itself, our family still didn't technically make it to the North, because Maryland is the Mason-Dixon line. And so a lot of those experiences that we're talking about that would happen in the Deep South, we think of in our mind as happening in the Deep South, were happening right here, right down the street. We're happening right down the street in Virginia as well. And those experiences shaped my family. In terms of constant migration, as a result, not really having the ability to find sustainable intergenerational wealth through the means of property, having like a family home, definitely took an effect. And so my family has been very transient. When I speak to my own experience with my mom, just to give you a quick example, I went to 4 different schools in 8th grade for the purpose of my mom trying to make sure that I had access to the resources that I needed and that she could provide for me. And when I look back on those experiences, I definitely understand how they're interconnected to all of the ways in which our family was treated. People not necessarily being able to access the GI Bill the way that they should. My great uncle essentially not being able to get the full amount of property and his benefits. So when we're talking about a lot of these dynamics, we're talking about a centralized story that affects a lot of people that is still going on today, still affecting how we look at each other today. And so now I want to shift gears, because my own personal story isn't as interconnected to Columbia and Howard County, although I have some awareness because of the experiences I've had. I want to shift to Denise for her to connect to the personalized experience of Columbia and then also where we're at.
Thank you, Trent. So when my parents moved to Columbia, they moved to Harper's Choice area, a Swansfield, a neighborhood. And the dream at the time was very fresh. Rouse's dream was for an interracial, intercultural community where there were village centers and then neighborhoods. And then within that village center, you had a community center, you had a supermarket, you had a center where people congregated. So they didn't really have to leave their villages. Then the mall was built, and the high schools and the schools started to be built. And many of my peers were part of that experiment. And I would say a lot of my Black peers, their parents came from DC and from Prince George's County and from Baltimore City. And we banded together because even though this was a sense of a dream, we never had a real great opportunity to talk about the migration into Columbia, Maryland, what it meant to a lot of families, especially the generation of my parents, who were in their 50s when they moved out to Columbia, and they spent over 30 years of their life there. Both my parents are deceased. But the way they saw Columbia was that it was a dramatic difference from Baltimore City and a lot of the crime that was starting to flourish in a lot of the neighborhoods that people lived in. But what I think was missing in Rouse's wonderful dream was we never talked about why people of color, people of African descent really needed to feel like they were being treated with respect, why they needed a community to support them and to hear their stories of the Great Migration, to hear why it had been difficult to live in certain places and why this Columbia experiment was vitally important. And I think if we could have had those concerted stories, because I know I didn't in high school. And if any of my peers are on the line with me who went to Walled Lake, and I also went to Mount Hebron, I had to jump around to Trent because high schools weren't built at the time I moved to Columbia. And I graduated from Howard High. But we always wanted to be nice. We always wanted to be in the sense of, everybody's just getting along. But these stories are important because I think the dream of Rouse's was admirable and aspiring. But without that dream having the stories embedded in how we live together, you have what Columbia is now. And that's not as collective and not as much of an intercultural community where people are really showing up and being authentic in their authentic historical and cultural perspectives. And so as we move forward, I think these conversations need to happen as to why we don't want to redline Columbia, why we don't want to have our students feel like this school's better than that school. It's not how it started. But if we don't have these conversations that Trent and I are providing today and utilizing the Great Migration as our context of why stories are important, we will continue to live in segregated communities. We will continue not to understand that people need to be all over Howard County. They need to feel welcomed all over this wonderful county we live in. And so, Trent, is there anything you want to say before we move into answering any questions that people may have? I know that this is where I'm standing as someone who was part of this experiment and someone who wants to see a greater conversation happen around what it means to be a diverse and inclusive intercultural community.
Definitely. I think the one thing I'd like to have us thinking about as we join in this conversation is what does it mean to be accepting of people within the county? And meaning that from an individual standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, and from a structural standpoint. What ways in which are we inviting people to be a part of this dream, to be a part of this amazing experiment? And even in saying that, I think I want to recognize that oftentimes I think we conflate Columbia's vision with Howard County's vision. Mm-hmm. And then the difference of how we see the nuance in that, I think would be worth exploring as well.
I pick up my life and I take it with me. And I put it down in Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Scranton, any place that is north and east and not Dixie. I pick up my life and I take it on the train to Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Seattle, Oakland, Salt Lake, any place that is north and west and not south. I am fed up with Jim Crow laws, people who are cruel and afraid, who lynch and run, who are scared of me and me of them. I pick up my life and I take it away on a one-way ticket, gone up north, gone out west, gone. Thank you, Langston Hughes. Thank you, all our ancestors who migrated all over the country for a better life, who made it so that you left us with a legacy of resistance and survival.